Hello, my name is Brian Summers. I'm an Isilon pre-sales engineer, and every week I do a demo. It's about 1 hour long on Thursdays around 1 o'clock Central Time. And in that demo, I go into a lot of detail about Isilon and how it works and all that good jazz. And at the beginning of every week at the beginning of that call, I mentioned the Isilon simulator, which is, you can see here there's a link, the Isilon simulator download link. So this video is really to go more in depth on that simulator. Um, and this simulator is for anyone who wants it. So customers, partners, employees, whoever's interested. You can use this link to download it. And I'm going to walk you through that process of where you get it, how you set it up, what the configuration process is like. And hopefully this will be a good video to kind of accompany the weekly demo that I do for anyone who's interested in following along. So let's just dive right in here. So if we go to this link, Isilon Simulator Download, then what we're going to see is this page here. So this link gets you here. And on this page, you can see there's a download link here. The latest version of the Isilon Simulator will always be posted here. So if you download this one today and you want the newest one later, just come on back and whatever the newest one is will be right here. So hopefully you just bookmark that link and reference that for future use. I've already downloaded this ahead of time and I've unzipped the file. Specifically, the file you download here is called an OVA, so it's a virtual appliance that you're downloading. And to help you visualize what it is we're simulating here, a single OVA file represents an Isilon node. And I won't get into a whole bunch of detail because I do that in my weekly call. But in that weekly call, I show you this visual here where I point out that this blue area is a node. And then, of course, in this setup, we've got 4 nodes. So nodes 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I point that out because as we go through here, I'm going to set up 4 nodes in VMware Workstation. And this is the hardware that we're simulating with this simulator. Also, if I were to pull one of these nodes out and take a closer look at it, um, then what you'll see is on the rear of the node, for the sake of this video, there are 2 ports that we're really worried about, and it's these 2 ports here on the left. Those 2 are what we refer to as the back-end ports, but as we go through the simulator, you'll see that referred to as the internal network, or INT. And specifically, when we go through the setup, you'll see a reference to INTA, so int A. That's just referring to internal network A, which would correspond to one port or the other. And then we'll also see a reference to internal B, which would be referring to the other port on this card. The other 2 ports over here on the right, those would be our external network. We'll also go through and set that up, so we'll see what that looks like. But physically, I just want you to have something concrete to think of in your head when we go through the setup wizard, so it's not just all abstract and lost. So that's what we're doing there. To give you one more visual before we dive in, I will also jump back to here. And every week in the demo, I go into a good bit of detail around this architecture here. So specifically what I'm calling out is this backend network, which is going to connect to those 2 ports I was just talking about, also known as the internal network. And also you've got this front end network, which corresponds to the other 2 ports I was referring to. So notice that both are redundant networks. You've got 2 switches back here and 2 switches over here. So when we start to see A and B, so internal network A, that's going to be switch A. Internal network B, that's going to be switch B. And then of course when we see external A and B, we're referring to these 2 switches, the external network. So hopefully that helps. A lot of times verbiage causes chaos. So the front end network, also known as the external network, the back-end network, also known as the internal network. Keep those things in mind. With that in mind, let's jump into VMware Workstation and get started with setting up the simulator. So you can see here I have a Windows user set up, just a Windows 10 machine running. I'm going to access the cluster at some point in the demo from Chrome here, but first we have to set up the cluster so that we can access it. So to do that, I've got this Isilon folder here. I've got nothing going on, and I need to go ahead and spin up 4 nodes like we just looked at. So to do that, I just come here to File and Open. I browse out to wherever I've downloaded and unzipped that OVA file. Then I'm going to click open here. I'm going to name this really whatever you want. My naming scheme includes 3 letters so I know what operating system we're talking about. So I'll do Izzy for Isilon, and then just whatever makes sense. So Izzy node 01, for example. You can leave this on your C drive. I prefer to put it on an external USB drive, so I'm going to change this to drive letter E, and then I'm just going to hit import. Now this step here might take a few seconds, might take a few minutes, really just depends on the horsepower of your machine and if you're doing 1,000 things right now. So we'll let this finish. And what this process is analogous to, this is analogous to racking and stacking the node. So we're literally cabling it into the backend network and all that sort of thing. So in fact, if I look here at node 1 now, you can see here that there's 2 network adapters on the virtual appliance. There's host only, which is our internal network, and then there's the NAT adapter, which is our external network. Keep that in mind because that'll be relevant when we get to configuring the network here in a bit. So I'm going to pause the video here while I go ahead and rack and stack nodes 2, 3, and 4, and I'll be right back. All right, now you can see here that I've got nodes 1, 2, 3, and 4 racked and stacked. A couple key callouts. One, I'll just repeat what I did a moment ago, and that is that we've got 2 network adapters here, the host only, which is our internal network, and the NAT, or the network address translation, which is our external network. So that's a key call out. Another one is that in the weekly demo, I point out that the Gen 6 hardware we ship, so again, let's go back to this visual here, um, includes 60 hard drives. So we talk about these drive sleds and how there's anywhere from 60 to 120 drives in there. So I want to point out that here, of course, this is a simulator, so we've only got a handful of drives. You've got a boot drive here as well as just a handful of virtual drives, if you will. So that's a couple key differences there from an actual, Isilon hardware setup. So I point that out because as we go through the setup wizard here, we're going to have to come up with some IP addresses. And to know how to do that with the appliance, you need to take note of the host only and the NAT networks to understand what's going on there. So what I'll do is I'll come here to edit, and I'll go to virtual network editor. And I'm not actually going to edit anything. I just want to see the details of these 2 networks. So you notice again, the first network adapter here is the host only network. That's what VMware Workstation calls VMnet1. And that corresponds with an IP address scheme that's already been defined, specifically 192.168.244, fill in the blank, right? And then the NAT, or the external network, corresponds to 211. And these aren't networks I've set up ahead of time. This is just kind of stock stuff when you install VMware Workstation or Player. So go into your network settings and take note of what these 2 IP addresses are, because this will be relevant as you go through the setup wizard for Isilon. So that's what that is. I'm going to go ahead and power on node number 1 right now. You might be inclined like me to just kind of get in a rush and power on nodes 1, 2, 3, and 4 all at the same time. You can certainly do that. I prefer not to, just because again these are running off an external USB hard drive for me, and that actually makes it take longer. So if you're rocking some sort of really awesome internal solid state drive, feel free to just fire them all up at the same time. But I'm going to do these one at a time. And here you can see in the boot up process, it's like any Linux or Unix machine. It's just kicking off some scripts to do some self checks and whatnot. Here in a moment, we're going to get prompted with a yes or no question. And that is really just asking us if we do want to go ahead and format the drives. And again, the drives we're formatting are just those virtual hard drives we looked at a moment ago. So here we go. We'll go ahead and say yes. Please go ahead and do that. That'll take just a few moments, and then it'll get to the login prompt. And once we're at the login prompt, I'm sorry, not the login prompt, the setup wizard. And once we're at the setup wizard screen, then we're done for now with node 1, and we're going to go ahead and repeat this process for nodes 2, 3, and 4. But here you can see it's formatting those drives. Those are the virtual drives. And it goes through pretty quickly and gets to 100% on each drive. So we'll give that a moment. And I will pause the video as we go through here for any redundant or super boring parts, just to save on time. But for here, I'm just going to go ahead and let you see the full boot up process, just so you're familiar with what's going on. Once you get past that drive formatting step, it goes pretty quickly. And as you can see here, now we're at the setup wizard. So I'm going to pause here for node number 1, and I'm going to go ahead and get nodes 2, 3, and 4 booted up and to this same point. And then when I return, we'll proceed with setting up the cluster. All right, so at this point, I now have nodes 1, 2, 3, and 4 all powered up, and they're all sitting at this wizard prompt here. So what I'm going to do now is on node number 1, I'm going to go through the create new cluster process, and that will initiate the cluster. And then for nodes 2, 3, and 4, we'll just go through the join an existing cluster process. So step 2 there. So here we are, node 1. I'm going to use option 1 to create a new cluster. Of course, the first thing you do whenever you set up any software is read the end user license agreement. So that's what we've got here. If you just hold down the space bar, you can read through that with superhuman speed. That'll get you to here. You definitely need to say yes to accept the EULA. First thing it's going to have you do is define the password for the root admin account, or I should say for the root account, because it's then going to ask you to set your password for the admin account. So those are two different accounts. Root often used at the command line, admin often used in the web interface. So from there, you're going to name the cluster. So I'll just say ISI cluster 1 for Izzy cluster 1. And then you can think of that name there, Izzy cluster 1, as really this folder here. So I'm going to actually come over here and rename this. We'll call this Izzy cluster 1. So when we define that name there, Izzy cluster 1, we're basically saying this whole group of nodes is going to be a cluster, and we're going to call that Izzy cluster 1. So I'll hit enter there. Here I'm going to pick a few steps to get through the setup. Option 8 here is for the standard UTF-8 encoding, so I'm just going to pick that one. And this is where we start to configure the networks. And as a reminder, we mentioned earlier that we would see internal A or int A. That is representing the back-end network. And A just refers to, we'll call it fabric A, so the first port and the first switch on the back end. So from here, let's go to option 1 to configure the net mask. And here I'm going to type 255.255.255.0. I'm going to skip 2 here because we don't need to configure the MTU. And I'm going to go right to 3 where I'm going to configure internal network A's IP ranges. So I'm going to say 3. And then I'm going to type 1 here to add an IP range. And then I'm going to type in 192.168.244.101. And then I'm going to type in 110. So I'm basically giving it 9 IP addresses. And then to figure out how to come up with those IP addresses, I'm going to refer back to a previous comment where I mentioned that there are 2 network adapters on each node, and that one of those adapters is mapped to the host-only network, which is what we're dealing with right now, is the internal network. So to see how I came up with 244.101.110, I'm going to come here to Edit, and I'm going to go to Virtual Network Editor. I'm not actually going to edit anything, but this allows me to see the 2 virtual networks that are kind of stock, already set up for Android or for VMware Workstation. And it's this host-only network that I'm worried about at the moment because I'm setting up the internal network. And you can see that by default that VMnet1, which is host-only, has .244. And then the NAT address, which we'll use when we get to the external network, is .211. So the reason I'm picking 244 here is because I'm setting up the host-only network. And when I get to the external network, I'm going to use 211. So that's why I'm doing what I'm doing there. So I'll hit enter. That gives me a summary then. My net mask is defined. My IP range is defined. and we'll go from there. So let's hit enter again. It here asks me here if I want to set up internal network B. If I had a second virtual adapter for that, I would do that. But right now I'm just going to set up A. Um, but in real world, you'd certainly want to set up both A and B, so you had a fully redundant backend fabric. From here, though, I'm going to hit enter again, and now I'm being asked to set up the external network. So I'm going to select 1 to set that up. And then I'm going to go through the exact same wizard that I did for the previous, for the internal network, but now I'm just doing this for the external. So again, I'm going to select 1, and then type 255.255.255.0. And then I'm going to skip number 2 because we don't need to do anything with MTU. And I'm going to type 3 to configure the external IP ranges. I'm going to type 1 to add an IP range. And here I'm going to do 192.168.211.101 and 110. And again, that's just corresponding directly with the virtual adapters that are already set up in VMware Workstation. So make sure you take a look at that. The other way to do that, if for any reason you don't have the option to go up here and edit the virtual network and see that, is on your local machine, you can simply go to the command prompt and then type ipconfig. And here you're going to see VMnet 1 and VMnet 8. And there's those IP addresses that we're talking about. So that's the other way you can see kind of how to make sense of that. So that's it. I've set up my netmask and IP ranges for both the internal and external networks. So what I've done at this point, just to come back to this visual, is I've defined the IP addresses to be used for this back end. And I've also defined the IP addresses to be used for this front end. So as far as the number of IPs you need to set aside, back end is pretty minimal because, again, it's just going to be an internal network for the nodes to talk to each other. Front end is going to depend on how many clients you've got out there that need to connect into your network or into your cluster, if you will. So keep that in mind. It's really up to the IT admin to decide how many IP addresses to set aside for this. But that's it there. And then I want to set up my gateway. That's always going to be the same IP scheme as your external network, just with the .1 on the end. So we'll do that. I'm going to skip past Smart Connect setup. We'll do that in a different video. I'm also going to skip past DNS for now. And then I'm going to skip past really everything else here. Except I'm going to go ahead and configure the time zone because I like to go ahead and tell it that I'm in Central Time. And then I'm just going to keep pressing enter to skip through everything else. So that's it. That's literally the most difficult part of setting up Isilon is what I've just gone through. So if you can do that, it's pretty easy to deploy. And then here you get your summary of everything you've done, and you just type yes to say I'd like to commit those changes. So what we've done at this point is using node number 1, we've defined the cluster, and we've said it's called Isi Cluster 1. We've told it what IP addresses it needs to use for the front and back end network. And that's it. That's what we've done. So what we're going to do from here is we're going to go on to nodes 2, 3, and 4, and we're going to join those into the cluster that we've just initiated. For node 2, what I'm going to do, for nodes 2 and 3 actually, is I'm going to join those to the cluster from the command line interface. So we'll do that here in just a sec. I'm going to pause while node number 1 finishes doing its thing, and I'll be back when it's done. All right, so node number 1 is completely set up at this point. We're here at the login prompt. If we're a command line person, we can go ahead and log in with a root or admin account, depending on who we are. So let's just go ahead and use root and then A, and we're logged in now. So very nice, unexciting command line interface. But from there, I'm going to go on to node number 2, and we're going to use option 2 here that says join an existing cluster. So if I go ahead and type 2 and press enter, I'm going to be shown a list of any clusters that are currently connected to that back-end network. And right now I see that Isi cluster 1 is available. So I'll type 1 at this point. There we go. And we'll join that cluster. So node 1 was a little more in depth. We had to go through that setup wizard. Nodes 2, 3, and 4, we're going to do exactly what I just did there. We're just going to tell it join an existing cluster, tell it which cluster to join, and hit enter, and we're done. So here you can see it's going through, it's formatting the drives and doing all the things, and node 2 will be done. There it is. We're now at the login prompt, and node 2 is now part of the cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for node 3 real quick, just to repeat the process. So I'm going to select 2 to join a cluster. I'm going to select 1 to tell it which cluster to join, and it's going to go through and join node 3 into the cluster. Now with that said, I could also join nodes to the cluster from the web interface. So I've shown you how to do that here in the command line, but now if I go here to my Windows user machine, and I open up Chrome, and I go to the IP address I set up for node 1, then I should be able to join in here. I'm going to click Advanced Settings, proceed to that anyway, and that'll take me to the web user interface where I can now log in again with either my root or admin accounts. And now I'm going to see the web interface for the first time. So here you can see from the work we've done over here in the command line, I already have a 3-node cluster set up, but I want to go ahead and bring number 4 online as well. So to do that here from the web interface, I can come here to Cluster Management and go to Hardware Configuration. And then here under the Nodes tab, I see all 3 of the current nodes up and running. I'm going to click Add Node to go find number 4. Check the box there for that guy, and I'm going to hit Add Node. So that's the exact same thing we just did through the command line interface for nodes 2 and 3, only this time we did it through the web UI. And that's it. So at this point, I have a fully functional, up and running Isilon simulator, if you will, virtual Isilon cluster. And I say fully functioning from I guess from a test dev point of view. Obviously, this is running on my notebook, so I wouldn't use this as a way to test performance or anything like that. If you're going to do any benchmarks, probably want some actual hardware if you need to do any performance testing, that sort of thing. But with that disclaimer, you can absolutely use this simulator as a full-fledged Isilon cluster to test, integration with your internal systems, to play with how to read and write data to and from the cluster, and all the things that I show in my weekly demo. So hopefully this helps. If there's any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or you can do that by dropping comments in the comments section here for this video. So let me jump back to this slide. Let's say, where is that sucker? There we go. There we go. So take note of this slide here. If you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, that's great. You can click this link here, Isilon Simulator Download, to download the bits and do what I just did. And then there's some other really good videos there that you can check out too. So appreciate your time and have a good day.